about the menstrual cycle, the hormones that fluctuate and how they fluctuate through the typical 28-day menstrual cycle, okay? And in fact, we're going to go over this in lab. So tomorrow in lab, we're going to cover male and female reproductive anatomy, and we're going to look at the menstrual cycle. And I'm going to have some worksheets and some models and some things so you can see these things in 3D sort of images. This is the standard menstrual cycle going from day 1 to 7, 14, 21, 28. This is what happens with LH, FSH. What do we call that red peak right there? The LH surge. What happens right after that happens? You should know this, especially those of you that made it during the power outage on Monday. We drew it all over the board. Ovulation, Simone, that's right. And yay, they're here. You're doing good. Yay. So LH surge, what happens preceding that is estradiol levels start to ramp up, 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 up. What's making the estradiol? What part of the female body or cells are making the estradiol? The follicles, the developing follicles, the cells of the developing follicles. We'll just say follicles. The growing ones, not the puny ones, the big ones. Now progesterone, after that LH surge, boom, ovulation, egg gets ovulated, progesterone starts to ramp up. These are the two main female sex steroids, right? Estradiol, 17-beta, and progesterone. What is making the progesterone? Yes, good job. You've got the corpus luteum, Alex, down. I can't talk, speak, and write at the same time. Luteum, L-U-T-E-U-M, okay? That's the remaining follicle that's still in the ovary, stays behind, and becomes hormone-producing tissue. Actually, LH allows the follicle to luteinize, become a hormone-producing tissue that pops out progesterone. These two, this one and this one, is what allows the building up, proliferating, and secretory phase of the uterus, the endometrium of the uterus. If you don't have high levels of E2 and progesterone, the female endometrium doesn't thicken, develop the spiral arteries, the secretory glands, and get nice and cushy to receive the recently fertilized egg, or the embryo, the early stage embryo. So those are all the hormones. We've talked about this. The follicles grow, they get bigger in size. Antral to Graafian, ovulate. Corpus luteum stays behind, makes progesterone. This is what's going on in the ovarian cycle. This is what's going on in the uterus, uterine cycle. The whole thing together is called what?
The menstrual cycle.
Right. Whole entire thing, there it is right there. Okay? That's the whole entire process. So if we take it apart, FSH and LH, they're controlled by GnRH release from the hypothalamus, and then there's negative and positive feedback from the ovarian steroid hormones. Okay, so remember, these are released in pulses throughout a normal cycle. They're kind of like this, but then they ramp up during the LH surge and FS surge, and they go really high. So that cycling, that pulsatile cycling, is happening with the negative feedback coming from estrogen and progesterone, mostly estrogen, keeping it sort of low, okay? Then what happens is when estrogen levels get high enough, you don't have to know the concentration, when they get high enough, they actually stimulate the brain to dump out lots of pulses of GnRH, and hence lots of pulses of LH and FSH. So it switches from a negative to a positive feedback. So FSH, what it does is it stimulates the development of the follicles so they get bigger in size. Here's the little small primordial ones out here. Once they get recruited to grow, they get bigger and bigger. Maybe that's the biggest, probably Graafian follicle right there that's likely going to ovulate. So the development of the follicles happens through follicle-stimulating hormone and estradiol production by the cells of those bigger developing follicles. So the bigger the follicle, the more estradiol it releases. Okay? And that's why the follicles are getting recruited every month, and they're growing during that period of time. They have more cells, and they're producing more hormones, and they're pumping out more estrogen. Okay? So the follicular phase is officially day 1 to 14. That's sort of what we refer to it in the menstrual cycle. Follicular phase because the follicles are growing, and they're getting bigger. Big antral follicles and a Graafian follicle at the end. This shows follicle recruitment, so the time frame is on the left. What's happening to the follicles is in the middle. Primordial follicles, these are all present in the little fetal human ovaries, even before birth. Oocytes get surrounded by just a little bit of follicular cells. they get contained. There's this initial recruitment where some of these get recruited to form primary follicles. It's easy to remember this for me. I mean, I study this, so it's easy. But in learning this, primary follicles have one row of follicular cells surrounding the oocyte. Secondary follicles have two rows, and it's hard to see on here, but really there's like two rows of follicles. They're recruiting more follicular cells, are dividing and encasing the developing oocytes. Going further, they become early tertiary or antral. I like that term better because it describes what they are. They have an antral fluid-filled cavity that starts to occur. They get bigger, they're growing antral follicles that get even bigger. Okay, so all of this right here, going from the early antral and down these later stages, this is dependent on gonadotropins, FSH and LH. So this doesn't happen until puberty. This is already happening in the fetal ovaries. This requires hormones to get to those later stages, to get to the tertiary and the, hopefully, Graafian follicle. Notice at every single stage there's these little gray, look like little ghost follicles. Follicles are dying at every single stage. That means the cells making up the follicle, the egg within it, the oocyte, are all degenerating and falling apart. We call that process atresia, which means kind of massive cell death, specifically referring to the follicles. Note, this is happening even before birth. Females are born with about 1 million follicles, primordial follicles. About 1 million, 500,000 to 1 million. And this process, every single month, every single year of life, results in cell death of the follicles and the eggs. And from this point, this is the initial recruitment going to primary follicle stage. And then this later recruitment, the cyclic recruitment, that happens every month with these hormones, the gonadotropin hormones, FSH. Every single month, about 1,000 follicles are dying. So about 1,000, give or take, every single month in an average woman. This shows primordial follicles can be there up to 50 years. Average age of menopause is about 51. It takes about 4 months to go from primary to secondary, about 2 to 3 months to go from secondary to early antral, 2 months to go to this stage, and about 14 days to go from a big antral follicle to the big fat Graafian follicle. So it takes several months for this cyclic recruitment. So there's always follicles in the ovaries at different stages, okay? And some win the race and get really big. Some never do, some actually die. The majority actually die. This reading goes into all that right from the Chapter 3 supplement. This shows micrograph images of the actual human ovary showing primordial follicles up along the cortex. You've got a lot of women have a lot of dormant follicles that are primordial from before birth. You have some initial recruitment. Some of those become primary follicles. Hard to see, but this is one row of follicular cells surrounding the oocyte. This is 2 rows of follicular cells surrounding the oocyte. Antral follicle, there's a little antral fluid-filled space that starts to occur, and we can see this through microscope images. We can also capture the number of antral follicles, so the fluid-filled ones, by ultrasound. And I've been a part of big research studies at Stanford, UCSF, and Kaiser Permanente, looking at the number of antral follicles that women have and the genes that are associated with that. There are genes that are linked with follicle number, believe it or not. Here's a bigger antral follicle that becomes sort of the big Graafian follicle that is actually going to rupture and be ovulated, shown right there. The corpus luteum, the hormone-producing tissue that's left behind in the ovary. And it looks kind of yellow and fatty because it uses cholesterol to pump out a lot of progesterone. And this is showing the hormone production that happens. In the ovary, cholesterol gets converted to some of these precursors that go ultimately to progesterone, and then ultimately to estrone, testosterone, and eventually the really active form of estrogen, estradiol 17 beta. Okay? So these main ones are sort of coming from the ovaries, the follicular cells of the ovaries. Note that female ovaries make androgens. They make testosterone. They make androgens. Those ultimately get converted to estradiol. Yeah, Sarah.
So it goes into 2 separate, like,
Pregnenolone
makes both of those, so it goes in 2 different directions?
Yep,
Okay.
yep. A lot of these biochemical precursors are like little intersections to different pathways. So lots of different stuff can be made from some of these starting out precursors of this lipid, cholesterol. This is why I had you learn cholesterol. We talked about fats in the beginning. It's really crucial for some of these hormonal pathways in women and in men. All right, good question. This looks crazy, but just to make it simple, a fecal cell, that's in the follicle, so this is in an antral follicle. This is just showing one of those cells surrounding the developing oocyte, okay, as it's developing and making hormones. This is another type of follicle cell. There's ones on the outside, there's ones on the inside. So here's the oocyte, and then there's all these layers of cells. The antral cavity is in the middle. So sort of the outer cells and inner cells, they're pumping out from cholesterol to ultimately through these pathways, they're kind of working together, making estradiol. Estradiol goes into the blood, okay? And that affects a lot of other tissues and structures of the body, including the brain, including the GnRH pulse generator in the brain. Then this is referring to the luteal cell. So this is of the corpus luteum. After the follicle ruptures and releases the egg, this is left behind and is able to convert cholesterol to progesterone and to estradiol. Again, through that similar series of pathways. You don't have to know this is the delta 5 pathway, this is the delta 4 pathway. If you were in biochemistry, you'd have to know every single piece of this pathway, all these intermediates. Just know that the follicle cells are making progesterone, estradiol, and then the same thing is happening with the corpus luteum. Actually, at even higher levels, it really starts to ramp up and make lots of progesterone. Okay, so that helps to maintain the uterine lining in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. This looks really confusing, but really what it's trying to show is that estradiol levels negatively inhibit GnRH, the brain and anterior pituitary, okay? So this is FSH and LH secretion levels, and this is estradiol levels. And what you can see is there's this bimodal sort of distribution, okay? There's a lot of secretion of FSH and LH when there's low estradiol, okay? So those levels are sort of high. Then as estradiol levels increase in the blood, okay, it goes up. It actually has a negative feedback effect on the brain and the pituitary. So FSH and LH are very low. Okay, they're pulsing very, very low levels. Here they're kind of higher. Then as estradiol reaches this sort of critical tipping point, what happens at the late follicular phase, LFP, that portion right there, the big follicles are now pumping out lots of estradiol. It gets to a critical limit, and this actually increases FSH and LH and makes this giant LH and FSH surge. It has a positive feedback effect at higher concentrations. So it switches from negative feedback, stopping it from going, to a very high positive feedback, making it go. This helps to trigger what we call the LH surge and ovulation. Now, interestingly, birth contraceptives, birth control pills, are playing on this system right there. We're keeping those levels at sort of a low monotonic level of estradiol and progestin. Usually it's a combination pill most people do, and it's kind of right around here. So it prevents high levels, which prevent the LH surge. Well, if a woman doesn't have an LH surge, what's not going to happen?
Ovulation.
Ovulation. No ovulation, no pregnancy. Yes? Okay. So we have a whole lecture just on that. So I don't want to get too into contraceptives right now. I want to stick to the biology of the menstrual cycle. But yes, you were going to go to contraceptives. Okay, go ahead, quick. Go ahead.
So, even though you stop ovulating, you still lose an egg.
You lose more than an egg. You lose about 1,000 follicles a month, regardless.
Okay, so follicles, I'm not crazy, it's just that that's another word for eggs, correct?
Egg with surrounding thousands of cells supporting it, keeping it all nice and safe and protected and making all the hormones is one follicle. You lose about 1,000 a month.
Okay.
What doesn't happen with contraceptives is you don't get that one big mature Graafian follicle and ovulates. That's just one egg. That's one egg. I mean, in a total lifetime of modern day women, we ovulate about 460 times.
So,
That's it. All the rest die. Millions die. We start with about 5 to 6 million in the embryo, cut it down to about 1 million at birth, and so forth. It just keeps declining. We have a whole lecture on that too. That's later. Okay? So what I want you to understand is this positive and negative feedback of estrogen. Biologists for a long time, reproductive physiologists, were like, how could low estrogen levels have a negative feedback, allow FSH and LH to be really high when estrogen is low, and then at moderate levels they inhibit FSH and LH release. It's all a check, sort of a check and balance feedback system, right? Allowing the pulses to happen and keeping the levels where they need to be. Then estrogen gets to a high level and it causes them to be released. So that bimodal sort of distribution was worked out up in the brain. This is in the hypothalamus. We know that the neurons that specialize and they make GnRH, we call them the GnRH GnRH neurons. They make that gonadotropin releasing hormone that controls the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary. There are neurons that are upstream. That means they synapse and impinge on that GnRH neuron. They're called KISS neurons because they make a peptide, a neural peptide called kisspeptin. It's all right here in the reading. Kisspeptin is the neurotransmitter that tells the GnRH neuron pulse generator, go, pulse out the GnRH, okay? Now notice estradiol has both negative feedback effects on one set of those KISS neurons. It says stop it, okay, don't go. That means we don't activate GnRH. That means we have no GnRH, or low levels of GnRH pulses. Higher levels, I'll put it in here, higher levels of E2, this is lower levels of E2, actually start to affect a different set of neurons. Kisspeptin neurons that go, oh, okay, it's time to go. Telling those neurons start pumping out kisspeptin, act on a receptor on the GnRH neuron, now it tells it, okay, make lots of GnRH pulses, and hence make lots of big fat pulse of LH and FSH. In this way, one hormone can have both stimulatory and inhibitory effects on this area of the hypothalamus, which is controlling reproduction. If I stop GnRH, that person is infertile. Yes? Okay, so GnRH is at the core. That's the master controller. That hormone is the one that controls reproduction and the menstrual cycle. So ovulation, we all already know, by the 10th to 14th day, notice there's variability. I say day 14 because that's a common 28-day cycle. But people can be sooner. 10 to 14th day after the first menstruation, one follicle becomes the mature Graafian follicle. Other secondary follicles start to regress, retract in and die. They become atretic, and this is a type of apoptosis. In biology, we refer to apoptosis as programmed cell death. It's almost like programmed cell suicide. The cells don't rupture and release all their acid and enzymes and everything, so they don't destroy everything around them, but they actually internally sort of create little vesicles and break down their components quietly, and so they don't ruin everything around them. This is a massive form of apoptosis where the follicles undergo atresia. Then the mature follicle is protected from atresia. So the one that's responding to the LH, to the incoming FSH and getting bigger and bigger, it has receptors that allow it to further respond to FSH. It wins the race in growing, and it is essentially protected against dying and falling apart. It's winning the race, and so it gains all the right biochemical processes and receptors that allow it to keep thriving. So if we look at ovulation in detail, that surviving one becomes so big it forms a bulge on the surface of the ovary, and this is the cortex, the outer surface of the ovary. This is the edge right here. We call that the stigma. It starts to make a stigma where it bulges out. And then in response to LH and then local prostaglandins, so cells responding to that LH coming up in the body start to dump out little prostaglandins that really help to mediate this whole rupturing of those cells, bursting and allowing the egg to actually be released from the ovary. Notice there's some cells, they're little granulosa cells that were in the inner part of the follicle surrounding the egg. They stay around it to protect it. So it's not just a naked oocyte or ovum. It actually has little granulosa cells around it. These are the fimbriae of the oviduct that are ready to sort of capture it. But if not fertilized, the oocyte degenerates after just a couple days, a few days. Okay, so if there's no fertilization, luckily, hopefully, usually it gets picked up by the fimbria, kind of hangs out and waits there at the distal ends of the fallopian tubes. If there's no sperm, there's no fertilization, the egg actually degenerates, it dies. I always get the question, what happens to the follicles? What happens to the eggs? Do they come out? They get resorbed. They die, the body recycles and reuses all of those. It's teeny, teeny, tiny, 100 microns. And then another couple 100 microns with the granulosa cells around it. So the ruptured follicle is what becomes that corpus luteum. Follicle stays behind, forms that crazy corpus luteum that makes what hormone? Progesterone. Progesterone is the hormone that maintains pregnancy. P prepares the uterus for pregnancy, PPP, okay? It helps maintain the thick uterine lining. If you don't have high enough progesterone levels, the female body is not going to be able to capture, maintain, and allow implantation of an embryo. The uterus has to be thickened, and that happens coming from progesterone from the corpus luteum. Okay, so if we look at it, we'll blow this up. There's little cilia, little tiny hairs that are on the fimbria, and there's little muscular contractions and they're moving. But notice the ovary and the fallopian tube are not connected. There's an ovarian ligament, holds the ovaries like little arms. Fimbria go over the top, and they're kind of just doing this. Someone asked me, I think Christina asked me after class on Monday, what happens if it doesn't get picked up? Well, that happens. If it doesn't get picked up and actually make its way inside of the ampulla of the fallopian tube, the swollen part out at the end, it can actually, if it gets fertilized, okay, so if the sperm, and they will keep going, they're looking for that egg, they'll keep going all the way out. If they fertilize the egg and it was not picked up by the fallopian tube, that results in something called an ectopic pregnancy. And I don't know if you guys are familiar, I've had my family members even go through that, close friends go through that, it's pretty common. Not extremely common, but a certain percentage of women will experience that, some more than once. So the fertilized embryo will divide and start going through development and will actually implant, because it's highly invasive, it's almost like a parasite. Was that, did you hear that beep?
Sorry, I don't know how, but that came from my computer.
That's okay. Okay, we're beeping and whistling. And okay, so the embryo implants wherever, and if it implants outside of the oviduct or outside of the ovary or on the uterus, it will be highly invasive. It'll erode away and start making the placenta. It can cause massive hemorrhaging, blood loss, and can be fatal for the woman. The woman can actually die. If it progresses enough and gets big enough, it starts to take over where it's at. There's no saving the embryo at that point. Ectopic pregnancies have to be removed because they are a fatality risk for the female. So, ectopic pregnancies are what happen when the egg or the early fertilized embryo does not make it inside the fallopian tube and is not able to traverse down and make it inside the uterus. Okay, sometimes it can happen in the fallopian tube itself. It just sticks around, stays right here. It doesn't make it to the uterus. Okay, this is gross. Okay, so this is a wake-up image. Take it, what is that?
The corpus luteum.
That's the corpus luteum, and it's all fatty and yellow. It's got all this fatty cholesterol-using cells that are converting it into the hormones, androgens and progesterone, making lots of it. It's in the cortex. It's a little transect going through the ovary. It's really important, though. This is what maintains the hormone levels and the early pregnancy. The placenta and the baby, or the embryo implanting and then starting to develop the placenta, doesn't start making hormones until later. So this is there to maintain the uterus for that early development of the embryo, if there is one. All right, so the luteal phase is due to the corpus luteal name. Luteal phase. What days does this happen? Typical 28-day cycle? 14 to 28, second half of the cycle. Ends with degeneration of the corpus luteum, so it dies, it regresses, it gets resorbed and recycled. Sometimes it sticks around, leaves like a little bit of a scar tissue for a little while. Happens every month, okay? Decreasing levels or the loss of progesterone and estrogen stimulate the sloughing off of the endometrium, the inner lining of the endometrium, and menses, menstruation. That's what it's from. You get a loss of P and E. The endometrium responds to those hormones. If it's not there and it goes away, when the corpus luteum dies, you lose it. Okay, the endometrium gets sloughed. Now, if there is development, there's implantation and an early placenta developing. There are signals that tell the corpus luteum, keep staying alive, keep making the progesterone, keep that going until we can get the placenta actively making lots of hormones. Pregnancy tests actually assay for those specific hormones. We're going to do that in lab in a couple weeks, pregnancy tests and the hormones that they measure. So if that doesn't happen though, you lose the endometrium. Females lose the endometrium. Note there are receptors for progesterone and estradiol that are in the cells of the uterus. Okay? So the uterus is responding to those hormones and growing and proliferating, developing spiral arteries. So every month there's this vascularization of building up that tissue, tons of new cells, new blood vessels, capillaries, arteries, and glands that secrete and make mucus and different secretions. That happens every single month. Later we're going to talk more about how they maintain a pregnancy, but that's later when we talk about pregnancy and lactation. I didn't put the names in here just so we could kind of fill it in. This is representing the endometrium, not the thick muscular part of the outer uterus, but the inner lining that's critical for implantation and development. We have here in this first part, this is about day 1 to 5. This is about day 14. and that's about day 28. Now we talk about the uterus, there's this building or proliferating phase that's happening here in this whole beginning after it was lost and sloughed off, which you can see is very low right here. It's not cushy, it's not thick, it doesn't have a lot of blood vessels. That's all being lost. This is the menses, or the menstrual phase. This is, what phase is that? Okay, we're focusing now on the uterine cycle. We left the ovary cycle, the ovarian cycle. Now I'm just focusing on what's going on in the uterus in response to those hormones. We call this the uterine cycle. 3 different words, although this one's the same in both. Menses or menstrual cycle.
Proliferative?
Yes. Proliferative. So then therefore this is a lot of secretory glands, continued growth, continued secretions, cushiness for the maybe baby. That was good. Okay, what's this called? Secretory. Okay? So this is what's going on in the uterus. Uterus is responding to the hormones coming from the ovaries and coming from the pituitary, right? In a different way. It's getting ready to capture and allow that implantation of a maybe baby. Okay? All right. So there's a lot of variability in this process, right? A lot of variation among women. I've depicted it sort of like 28-day cycle. That's the average. There are women that have a shorter cycle, 25. There are women that have a higher cycle length, 35 days, and kind of everywhere in between. What I want to address right here is look at the luteal phase in yellow. Is there a variation there?
No.
Nope.
It's all 14 days.
If we look at the size of these little time frames, same. Luteal phase is almost always the same in a cycling woman, independent on the woman. Okay, luteal phase is dependent on what? What is that? What determines the luteal phase? Not ovulation. The corpus luteum, the lifetime of the corpus luteum. That's it. The follicle that stays behind becomes luteinized, becomes the corpus luteum, starts making the hormone. It lasts about 14 days and then it dies. That's it. That's its lifespan. If there's no pregnancy and placenta starting to develop and grow to stay alive. If that's not there, it degenerates. That's always the same. What does vary is the follicular phase among women. This is something to be aware of. You can't just go, oh, day 14 of the cycle, that's when I ovulate. You don't really know that. There are ovulation tests to test that, and there's clinical assays that you can do, and temperature measurements and all these things, because right before ovulation, there's a peak in temperature, body temperature, and you can measure that. We're going to look at those in lab as well. So you can have a follicular phase that's about 16 days, about 9 days. This is kind of the standard because from 1 to 14, that's kind of the length of menstrual and follicular all together. And then there's 6 days, which is real short. Menstrual phase also is depicted as being 5 days, but you all know that's not how it is. People can be 1 day a week. They can be 3 days heavy or like real light for like a whole week. And there's a lot of variation here. Variation, pretty constant, okay? And I don't know how many of you guys use, there's lots of neat apps now. There's one I specifically like, I use myself, okay? The P tracker, have you heard of this?
Yeah.
How many of you guys use this? Just curious, if you're a female and you menstruate.
I used to.
Okay, so lots of you stopped doing it. So the nice thing is got the calendar feature, you know, so you pull up the calendar, you can track, okay, started today, stopped today. You can have little intimate, little markers on here. It predicts based on the pattern of the preceding couple months, how long your cycle is, and therefore when you ovulate. But it's not very quantitative. It just takes the average and goes, put the ovulation right in the middle. So if you have a 28-day cycle, it'll go, poof, ovulation on day 14. Okay? So we know follicular phase, menstrual phase, vary among women. So unless you really know yours very well, you don't really know. But this is saying the estimate is a little flower. So a lot of people are like, oh my God, avoid the flower. So, but that's not super accurate, okay? And you can be irregular, and that's not going to be accurate at all. You could be 90 days between menses, and then 28 days between menses, and it's going to pop out of average and be somewhere crazy, so it's not predictable. But if you're fairly regular and predictable, it is nice because if you can keep track of everything. For me, I'm a little neurotic. I like to-do lists. Like if I have a vacation and everything's going on, I kind of want to know, you know, I'm going to be like at that period of time, literally that period of time. I sort of want to know. And it allows you to be a little bit more proactive about your reproductive health and your cycling in your body, because that is telling you something. If you're not cycling for a long time, there could be something going on. It could be stress related. It could be hormonal related. It could be coming from your ovaries. or just activity. You're super, super active. So I like using those. And it's not so much a trustworthy thing for fertility, it's more a tracking, literally kind of a tracking so you can stay on top of your reproductive cycling. Was there a question about that? Tatiana?
I
Yeah.
stopped using that
Okay.
because I found a better app that's
Oh.
more accurate in like if you're irregular. It's called Eve.
Eve, I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, and there's also
Okay.
like a discussion section where we can talk to other women and be like, is this normal?
Right.
Like that kind of stuff.
I saw that, and the P tracker now has that same function, I think because competitors were doing that, but you gotta pay $2 for it, and I'm cheap, I don't wanna pay $2. But they have, like, you can upgrade to like the gold, and then there's chats and conference things where you can talk to other people and share. So Eve is another one, that's good to know. Yes,
Okay.
Jada,
I'm probably gonna sound stupid or not.
That's
but
okay.
then, like, how am I supposed to track my period if I'm using like birth control and I just like don't even bleed at all? Like, I don't know. It tells me like 9
okay,
days.
well, if you have no,
Is
if you have
there
no
something wrong with
menstruation,
me?
no, there's nothing wrong with you.
I don't know what's going on.
There's nothing wrong with you, and a lot of reproductive devices like IUDs, intrauterine devices, we'll talk about those in our contraception section of the course. You won't bleed at all. Many women will not have a menstrual flow at all. And so tracking in that case, occasionally you'll spot or you'll have it. You can track that on there, but it's not going to be as valuable. Also, if you're taking oral birth control pills, those make you very regular. Either you bleed every month or every 3 months or every 6 months, sometimes every year. It's not going to be super valuable. This is more for sort of natural cycling, or if you have irregular cycling and you want to sort of keep track. Yeah, that's young.
Not to keep plugging Eve, but like you can track symptoms. So like
Right.
I don't bleed every month
Right.
with birth control, but like I get the same like symptoms like back pain,
Mhm,
headache,
mhm.
and it'll tell me like, oh, you're probably like you would be bleeding now.
Right,
if
right,
you
right.
weren't.
So it's a little more predictive, taking in symptoms and characteristics into effect when you do it. Yeah, so check those out. I think it's good, regardless of what contraceptive device, if any, it's good for you to keep track of your own sort of reproductive health and what's going on. I would encourage you to do that. This is a neat image, a big image showing the myometrium, the muscular part of the uterus, and then the inner endometrial part in pink. What you can see is there's lots of blood vessels and it's all kind of invaginated here. And it gets built up and sloughed every month with menses. So this is the endometrium, this is the muscular myometrium. When a woman becomes pregnant and uterus enlarges, this thins out, gets really big. These are the muscles that contract and expel the fetus out of the woman's body, okay? What you lose in the menstrual cycle is the inner lining of the endometrium. Okay, so free response. I just want you to just quickly, we'll go over this as a group. What's it called when someone's menstrual cycling stops? Now, before you answer, there's 2 types.
Which one is it? Yeah.
There's 2 types. Good, Lauren. There's 2 types. I could not start cycling ever. Like I've entered puberty sort of, but I didn't start cycling. And that's kind of delayed. I'm waiting for my first menstrual period. That's one type. I've already started cycling. I've been cycling for a period of time, and then I stopped. There's 2 different names for those 2 features.